welcome to our deep dive. This time, we're exploring the Boston Massacre. I think most people have heard the Boston Massacre, but we're going to go deeper. We're going to really unpack it.
Yeah.
We'll look at the stories, the firsthand accounts.
Eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, and all that propaganda. Oh, and of course the trial. It just captivated the nation.
It's fascinating how this one clash in Boston,
Yeah.
on a snowy night, it just became this symbol, this turning point, between the colonists and Great Britain. But the story really begins weeks earlier when this young boy, Christopher Sider, was killed.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize there was something that big, like an event leading up to the massacre itself.
His death on February 22, 1770, at the hands of a customs employee, it really set things off. Tensions were already high. Just imagine you're living in Boston, bustling port city, the center of colonial life, but also this place where resentment against British rule is brewing.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine what that atmosphere was like. What were some of the main sources of tension at the time?
Well, the Townshend Acts, enacted in 1767 by Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, were a major point of contention. They basically levied taxes on goods imported from Great Britain. Things like tea, glass, paper, paint.
So like everyday things that colonists would have to use.
Exactly. Colonists felt like these taxes were a violation of their rights, a blatant attempt by Britain to control them without their consent.
Yeah, totally. So we've got these taxes, these deeply unpopular taxes, and then a young boy is killed. It really sounds like things were like reaching a boiling point.
Got it. Sider's death was really heavily publicized, and it became this rallying cry against British oppression. And this was all just weeks before the massacre. Now, add to this volatile mix the arrival of British troops in 1768.
Right, to enforce those very taxes that were like fanning the flames, right? But you mentioned earlier that this wasn't exactly a peaceful occupation. What happened?
Well, for the colonists, the troops themselves were just this constant reminder of British authority. And their presence led to all these clashes, all these frequent clashes with colonists. One particularly bad incident involved John Hancock, a prominent merchant and, a vocal critic of British policies.
John Hancock. I know the name, but remind me what he was known for.
Well, he was really successful, a businessman, a smuggler, a symbol of colonial defiance. His ship, the Liberty, was seized by customs officials for alleged smuggling.
Oh, right. So not really the kind of guy who was going to back down from a fight with the British?
Not at all. The seizure of the Liberty was a huge blow. It was seen by many colonists as an attack on their livelihoods and their liberties. Think about how you'd feel if your own government suddenly imposed all these unfair taxes and then started taking away your property. It was a direct challenge to their sense of autonomy.
Yeah. I can see it. That would really, fuel the resentment. Okay, so we've got British troops in the streets. You've got the Hancock incident, and then the death of this young boy. This is all happening just before the massacre, right?
Exactly. And to really understand how tense things were, we need to look at the Journal of Occurrences. Basically, these anonymous articles published in newspapers. They chronicled all these clashes between colonists and soldiers. They really shaped public perception.
Hold on. Anonymous articles. That sounds like a very early form of propaganda.
Yeah, you could say that. These articles were often, exaggerated or biased, and they really painted British troops as these aggressors, and that just further inflamed tensions. Think about how information spreads today through social media, all the different news outlets. It's a reminder that the way events are portrayed can have a powerful influence on public opinion.
So these journals of occurrences were essentially just like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, precisely. They helped solidify this whole narrative of British tyranny and colonial victimhood. It created an environment where any incident, even something small, could escalate into something much, much more serious. Which brings us to the night of March 5th, 1770, the night of the Boston Massacre.
All right, so the stage is set. Tensions are really high in Boston. It's cold, March 5th, 1770. What happened? What actually sparked the Boston Massacre? Help me, visualize the scene.
Okay, so picture this. You've got a lone British sentry, Private Hugh White, standing guard outside the customs house. And he's surrounded by this rowdy crowd of colonists. Some are throwing snowballs, some are taunting him. It's just this scene of, chaos and aggression.
So this one soldier is basically facing off against an angry mob?
Yeah, pretty much. And from this crowd, a key figure emerges. Crispus Attucks. He was this towering former slave, described as a man of, strength and presence. He becomes kind of a leader in the crowd. And his presence really just adds to this tension.
Oh, wow. I'm picturing this scene, the sentry, the growing crowd, Crispus Attucks kind of stepping forward. What happens next?
Things escalate pretty quickly. Captain Thomas Preston arrives with reinforcements, bayonets fixed, trying to, control the crowd, which is getting more and more hostile. The scene is pure pandemonium. Snowballs are flying, insults are being hurled. The whole situation is, teetering on the brink of violence. In fact, Henry Knox, who would later become a general in the Revolutionary War, he was actually there that night, and he personally warned the soldiers not to fire.
Wow, so even in all that chaos, there were people, urging restraint. Did anyone listen?
Well, Captain Preston himself acknowledged the warning. He said that he understood the gravity of the situation. But tragically, shots rang out. The exact sequence of events is still debated today. But one thing's for certain. 5 colonists lay dead or fatally wounded.
5 men dead. That's a horrific outcome. Can you tell me about the victims? Who were they?
Their names are, etched in history. Crispus Attucks, the former slave. Samuel Gray, a rope maker. James Caldwell, a mariner. Samuel Maverick, a young apprentice. And Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant. Each one representing a different part of Boston society. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the city.
Yeah, it's tragic. You have this mix of young and old, different professions. It really highlights how this event impacted the whole community. So 5 men are dead. What happens next?
Well, the city's in an uproar. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was already super unpopular, tries to restore order. He promises a full inquiry, but the damage is done. The Boston Massacre, as it would soon be called, becomes this flashpoint, a symbol of British tyranny in the eyes of many colonists.
It became a symbol, but it also seems like it became a subject of a fierce debate. Didn't both sides try to control the narrative of what happened?
Oh, absolutely. The Boston Massacre wasn't just about the shots fired that night. It ignited this media battle, this war of words that raged across the Atlantic. You had pamphlets flooding Boston and London, each one telling a different version of events, each one trying to shape public perception. It reminds us that history is often as much about how events are perceived and interpreted as the events themselves.
That's so true. Even today, we see how the same event can be spun in totally different ways depending on who's telling the story. So were there any particularly influential images or accounts that came out of the Boston Massacre?
One image really stands out. Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. You've probably seen it. It depicts British soldiers lined up, firing into this crowd of seemingly helpless civilians.
Yeah, I mean, it's very powerful.
Yeah.
But I've also heard that it's not totally accurate.
Right. Revere, he took some artistic liberties, let's say. His engraving definitely captured the emotion and outrage. But it wasn't a photographically accurate depiction of what happened.
So you could call it a form of propaganda, meant to sway public opinion against the British.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how art, even when it's inspired by a real event, can be used to shape narratives and influence how people feel. It shows the power of images and symbols, especially back then, before photography and widespread literacy.
Okay, so we've got this powder keg of tensions, then the tragic event itself, and then this whole media battle erupts with, images like Revere's engraving adding fuel to the fire. So what happened next? Did the soldiers involved face any consequences for what happened?
They did. With Boston on edge, the trials began. The soldiers involved, including Captain Preston, were charged with murder, and the whole city was basically holding its breath, waiting to see if justice would be served.
And that's where John Adams enters the picture, right? The future president of the United States. Wasn't it a risky move for him to defend the very soldiers who fired on his fellow colonists?
It was definitely a controversial move, to say the least. But Adams, he was a staunch believer in the rule of law. And he felt it was his duty to make sure everyone, even British soldiers accused of a heinous crime, received a fair trial.
I could see how that decision must have been, incredibly difficult for him. So what was his defense strategy?
Well, his strategy was, it was both brilliant and complex. He basically argued that the soldiers had acted in self-defense. He painted the crowd as this dangerous mob that had provoked the soldiers. He even used racial slurs against Crispus Attucks, trying to portray him as a ringleader and further demonizing the protesters.
Wow, that's a really complicated aspect of this whole story. I mean, on the one hand, you have John Adams, who becomes this champion of American independence, upholding this principle of a fair trial. But on the other hand, he's using tactics that we would today recognize as deeply problematic and racially charged.
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial point. Adams' actions really highlight how complex things were at the time. They make us think about these difficult questions about the balance between justice and the fight for freedom. Even our heroes can be flawed. And their stories often force us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
Yeah. So after all of this, after the trials, the media battle, what was the final verdict?
After weeks of tense proceedings, the jury reached a decision. Most of the soldiers were acquitted, while 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, and they got relatively lenient sentences.
So a mixed bag of emotions for everyone involved, I imagine. A partial victory for Adams, relief for the soldiers, but probably continued anger and resentment for many colonists.
Exactly. And it's in this aftermath, in this mix of emotions and unresolved tensions, that we see the seeds of revolution really starting to sprout.
Wow, it's amazing how one event, the Boston Massacre, can be so layered, like all the drama, legal battles, propaganda. It just, it really makes you think. What's so striking to me is how these events from so long ago, from 1770, still, they still resonate with us today.
Yeah, it's true. It really shows how powerful these themes are. Justice, freedom, the struggle against oppression. We're still dealing with these same issues.
Yeah, it's like the echoes of the Boston Massacre are still, they're
Yeah.
still reverberating through the centuries.
Exactly. The events of that night and then the trials, they weren't just a historical footnote. They were a catalyst.
Mhm.
The Boston Massacre, it became this rallying cry for those seeking independence. It solidified this colonial anger towards British rule. It really pushed the colonies closer to revolution.
So this wasn't just about 5 men dying on a snowy night in Boston. It became this symbol, like a focal point for this whole movement toward independence.
Exactly. And the memory of those who died that night, their names, they fueled the fight for freedom and independence. Think about how powerful symbols can be. They can unite people, inspire action, really shape the course of history.
And in a way, the Boston Massacre continues to shape, how we understand history and how we look at events, even today, right?
Absolutely. It makes us think about how we get information and how we interpret it, especially today with, how the media is, the media battle that started after the massacre, the use of propaganda. It's very similar to how information is spread and manipulated today.
It makes you wonder, are we any better today at, figuring out what's true and what's fake? Are we critical of the information we see? Or are we still easily swayed by, these emotional stories and images?
Those are really important questions to ask ourselves. I mean, the Boston Massacre, it's a reminder that we need to look for different perspectives. We need to question our assumptions and really think critically. Don't just believe the first version of a story you hear. Dig deeper. Look for evidence. Consider different viewpoints.
Be an active participant in understanding the world, right?
Yeah.
Not just passively absorbing whatever information we come across.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's one of the most important things we can take away from this deep dive into the Boston Massacre.
So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you really hope listeners will take away from this deep dive?
I think it's important to remember that history isn't just about dates and names. It's about people, their stories, the choices they made, the consequences of those choices. The Boston Massacre, it was a tragedy for those who died. It was a turning point for what would become the United States. And it's a reminder that the fight for justice and freedom is still going on.
Yeah. Try to make sense of everything happening today. It's so important to remember the past, learn from it, and use those lessons to try to build a better future. Thanks for joining us on this journey through, one of the most pivotal moments in American history.